This humble and often overlooked train set represents a significant piece of toy train history. Let's investigate further on this episode of Toy Train Tips and Tricks. Hello again, this is Mike with another episode of Toy Train Tips and Tricks. Stay tuned to see bonus locomotive repair tips at the end of this video. And here we have a rather basic yet significant train set, Marx's The Meteor set of 1974. Not to be confused with their Disney Meteor set. At first glance, there's nothing special here at all. A basic Marx 4-wheel GE 70-ton diesel, followed by two basic 4-wheel cars and a 4-wheel caboose, all sporting non-operating Marx knuckle couplers. But on closer inspection, there are clues to another story. The story of the last, desperate attempt of a once great company to simply survive. Since the 1930s, the toy king, Louis Marx, had built a manufacturing empire, making a wide variety of toys for mass marketers and five-and-dime stores that resulted in Marx toys taking occupancy in the homes of nearly every child in America. Among these was the Marx line of O-gauge trains, which, after World War II, became the only significant North American competitor to Lionel's O-gauge trains. Marx's trains were durable, yet simple, and significantly cheaper than most of Lionel's products. But, as Bob Dylan sang, the times they were a-changin', and as the glory days of O-gauge trains in the 1950s faded into the 60s and 70s, toy trains accounted for less and less of the toy and hobby market every year. Toy train leadership was changing as well. In 1959, Lionel founder Joshua Lionel Cohen retired, selling his shares of the company he founded and handing the reins over to a new generation who ultimately oversaw the decline of his company. Louis Marx followed in 1972, retiring and selling his company outright to Quaker Oats. In the 1970s, when American companies used the word diversity, they were talking about their business operations, not personnel. Diversification was seen as a means of protecting large corporations from potential economic declines by branching out into as many different fields as possible. For example, Illinois Central Holdings, parent company of the railroad of the same name, at one time owned a large soft drink bottling company and Midas muffler shops, among other ventures. So it's not surprising that General Mills Foods would assume the production of Lionel trains in 1970, and that Quaker Oats, who also owned Fisher-Price Toys, would purchase the Marx Corporation outright in 1972. But while Lionel Trains was making steady improvements in sales under General Foods management, the Fisher-Price team under Quaker Oats was struggling with their Marx Trains acquisition. The Marx team decided it would take a bold move to recapture market share and to keep the train line viable. 1974 would be the make-or-break year for Marx Trains. First, train set packaging was changed to be more visually appealing. Colorful photos replaced the plain graphics of previous Marx sets. But to reduce costs, these boxes were not as solidly built as the plain cardboard predecessors, making original boxes in good condition difficult to find today. Next, the trains themselves were made more visually appealing. Tried and true locomotives and rolling stock received new, more colorful graphics and improved details. The artificial truck side frames of 4-wheel cars were painted black on the color-molded cars to make them look more like real 8-wheel cars. A new marketing strategy dubbed these new Marx sets the Great American Railroad Series, in an attempt to rekindle the nostalgia of the glory days of American railroading. But most importantly, these sets had to be priced right. Inflation pressures from the Vietnam conflict and later the 1974 oil crisis tightened family budgets so that every dollar mattered. Marx's basic sets reduced production costs by replacing metal wheels and axles with plastic. Some innovative thinking also contributed to the budget-friendly nature of these basic sets. While basic battery-operated train sets had proven somewhat successful in the past, the locomotives were simply on or off. The operator had no control over the speed of the train. Plus, there was the cost and inconvenience of frequent battery replacement. The Marx team devised an ingenious method of overcoming these obstacles by placing a 6-volt hobby battery, sold separately, inside a plastic control box. The box was wired to the track like a conventional transformer, but instead of household current, a consumer-provided battery provided the electrical source. While somewhat unusual today, these 6-volt batteries were common in the early 1970s to provide long-lasting power for flashlights and electric lanterns. Better yet, these batteries lasted significantly longer than traditional C or D-size batteries. Operators could control the speed and direction of their trains, but Marx eliminated the cost of providing a traditional transformer. Marx offered 2 such sets in 1974, each featuring small DC motors. The 70-ton diesel-powered number 2915, the Meteor set, and the 040 steam-powered number 2905, the Reliable set. The diesel set is somewhat easier to find today, suggesting that it outsold its steam counterpart. Retailers generally price these sets between $8 and $12, about half the price of a basic, conventionally operated Lionel set. The hope was that these sets would put a Marx product in the hand of more families, and these new train owners would later upgrade to traditional transformer-powered Marx trains after catching the train bug. It seems that in reality, while these battery-powered sets did sell well, those who wanted to upgrade either switched to more expensive Lionel products or switched to HO scale instead. In the end, while the Marx Meteor and Reliable sets sold well, the rest of the line sold so poorly in 1974 that Quaker Oats decided that there was no path forward for Marx trains, and so pulled the plug on Marx trains production by the end of 1975. There is evidence that the battery-powered sets were successful enough that some were produced in 1975 before the closing of the Marx Girard, Pennsylvania plant later that year. Due to their unique features and fragile boxes, collectors are often willing to pay $80 to $100 for an original, complete set with a good box today, significantly above the inflation-adjusted original purchase price. Using a DC power source, you can operate the Lehigh Valley diesel on a traditional O-gauge railroad, provided you do not exceed the 6 volts of input. The 2-wheel drive has no external gears, so there's no interference with any turnouts or crossing guardrails. The locomotives are Lionel track-friendly. While I'm generally not a fan of Marx 4-wheel rolling stock, the history buff in me appreciates the significance of these black-journaled plastic-wheeled cars from the very end of Marx train production. The other Marx sets offered in 1974 are also of interest to collectors. The Eagle Express was a slightly upgraded set with a traditional transformer and slightly more desirable rolling stock, but with a retail price roughly twice that of the battery sets, it sold so poorly that Montgomery Ward, for example, was still selling off its excess inventory as late as a decade later. The steam-powered Hotshot set, which was sold exclusively through Radio Shack stores, was an even greater sales disaster, likely because Radio Shack priced the set too high for the set contents, a princely sum of $24.95 or about $150 today. The ultimate prize from the Marx 1974 line was the Mohawk, their premium starter set featuring an E7 diesel in cars with operating fork couplers. The set had several things working against it, including the decoration for the Penn Central, whose spectacular corporate failure was one of the most infamous in American history, and its incompatibility with cheaper Marx sets as well as all Lionel products due to its fork-type couplers, and its high cost. Lackluster sales at the time have made this set one of the rarest and most valuable Marx starter sets among collectors today. But wait, there's more. As I began filming this episode, the original DC can motor in the locomotive died. This is not surprising, since can motors of 50 years ago were generally not as robust as they are today. I could have swapped the original drive for a traditional Marx 4-wheel AC power drive, but I wanted to keep this unique model as original as possible, so I began a search for a replacement DC motor. I checked the trainparts4marx.com site, an excellent source for original Marx parts, but no luck there. eBay? Nope. Basic Google search for Marx DC motor? Nope. Strike 3. My next stop was Amazon, where I started searching for 6-volt DC hobby motors. And believe it or not, within the first few selections was a motor that looked nearly identical to the original Marx. The length was identical, the shaft length was the same, even the motor mount holes were in the same place. The only difference that I could tell was the new motor was slightly smaller in diameter than the original. For $6.99, it was worth a shot. Less than 24 hours later, the new motor arrived on my doorstep. What an amazing world we live in. The physical inspection verified what I had seen on my computer screen. The motor was nearly identical to the original. This would be an easy swap. The original motor simply pulled straight out of the metal housing. The new motor fit the mounting perfectly, but would need a little bit of two-sided tape to mount it snugly. My next challenge was how to remove the brass gear from the original motor shaft. This went much easier than I had anticipated, and it came off easily with the use of a small pry bar. The next challenge was in determining how to mount the old gear on the new drive shaft. Surprisingly, I had success with Superglue Fix-All Adhesive, which is a gel-type superglue product. I set the glued assembly aside to dry for about an hour, and to my shock, it was snug and secure. While the glue was drying, I removed the blue wire from the old motor and soldered it to the new. Then I soldered the red wire, still attached to the locomotive, to the other motor lead. After testing the motor's electrical connections, I remounted the motor in the locomotive frame using double-sided tape to keep the motor snug in the mount. Make sure the mounting holes on the motor sit securely on the two mounting nubs on the motor. Finally, what to do with the blue wire? When I removed the locomotive shell, the wire was already loose, and I could not see any obvious locations for the wire to attach to the grounded metal frame. I finally concluded that the cheapest and easiest solution for Marx was not a soldered connection, but rather a simple physical connection with the bare end of the blue wire secured to the grounded locomotive frame by the metal mounting clip of the model shell itself. I duplicated this method, although I used a small spot of superglue to hold the wire in place long enough to reassemble the shell to the frame. With the shell still off, I took the opportunity to add some fresh plastic-safe lithium grease to the plastic gears, off camera. Replace the model shell by inserting the metal clip inside the shell into the groove in the locomotive frame, with the bare end of the blue wire between the two. Then carefully resecure the front frame tabs by gently prying the two sides of the plastic shell out. The tabs should seat securely into the two molded holes in the shell. One last electrical bench test, and success! I set up a temporary oval of O27 track for the set, as my permanent layout is currently unusable due to some construction. I used an old HO scale DC pack, which I checked with a voltmeter first to determine where the 6-volt setting of the throttle was. I didn't want to burn out my new motor with excessive power. There's plenty of room under the shell to add an LED headlight or even some resistors to prevent motor overloading, but I wanted to keep this engine as close to the original as possible. Despite the weight of the metal frame and a traction tire, the two-wheel drive is not a great puller. I found that adding one additional car to the set was the maximum load. However, the original motor might have been a bit more powerful, I can't say. Also, the plastic axles and wheels of the set add a significant amount of friction. Perhaps lubricating the axle bearings with a plastic-safe oil would improve pulling power. Now, back to my original script. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, and if so, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends and neighbors. Whether Marx or Lionel, new or old, keep the trains running, and we'll catch you next time on Toy Train Tips and Tricks.